I actually had a grandfather who was in Michigan, and he had barrels in the basement, and so I was intrigued by that. I hadn't planned on being a wine guy, but initially I was an ad guy. I was a madman. And my experience was working at J. Walter Thompson in Chicago. I worked on packaged goods accounts, and then I wanted to return home to Seattle, my hometown. And I got here and I worked for an ad agency, and they had this little account called Chateau Ste. Michelle. Didn't advertise much, but I was intrigued by wine, and I came out here all the time. And after a couple of years, the VP of marketing got promoted to president, and he said, "How would you like my old job?" And I said, "Why not?" And that was 33 years ago. I am Ted Baesler, and I am the CEO and president of Chateau Ste. Michelle. It was about a $20 million business, losing $2 to $3 million a year. In fact, when I first came here, we were supposed to make $1 million that year, and at the end of the year, they reported $3 million loss. My immediate reaction was, this will be a short-term gig. Chateau Ste. Michelle is the largest winery, but that was not always the case. In fact, one of my first projects here when I came in marketing was to launch Columbia Crest. And that was highly successful, became a million-case brand before anybody in Washington thought you could have a million-case brand. And then in 2009, it became the #1 wine in the world from the Wine Spectator. And I don't remember exactly when that was, but it was November 16th at 7:16 in the morning. It was a big deal. Part of the challenge was convincing people that Washington wine was really good. And I remember a time when I was in Connecticut, and we were in a restaurant, and I said, "I'd like a bottle of this Chateau Ste. Michelle Chardonnay." And the waitress said, "Oh, I wouldn't do that." I said, "Why?" She says, "I prefer French wine, specifically Pouilly-Fuissé." And then she said, "And by the way, you shouldn't order that Ste. Michelle because it comes from Washington, D.C., and it's way too humid to grow wine grapes there." One of the things that I think is challenging for the state, it doesn't have a unique name like Oregon or California or Italy. It has a name that is synonymous with Washington, D.C. So you have to say state. That's part of the issue, is you have to say Washington State, and then immediately the concept is Seattle, Washington, and it rains all the time there. Of course, the vineyards are on the other side of the state. So 60,000 acres of vineyards in premium land, 300 days of sunshine, but people don't realize that. When I started, there were 36 wineries in Washington. Today, there are over 1,000. And it has grown dramatically during the course of time, from 6,000 acres of vineyards to about 60,000. People just didn't believe that it was quality wine made in Washington. And that's when we started doing what we called Red Star Rising. There would be tastings, and we would go out with our distributor community in particular and do these blind tastings. And they would pick Washington wines, 1, 2, 3, and it would be over great wines like Haut-Brion and Lafite and all these wonderful Bordeauxs. They would pick them ahead. Cabernet is clearly the main variety in the state. Number 2 would be Chardonnay, and number 3 is Riesling. And Riesling is the roots of the company. There was a LA Times tasting in 1974, and there were German Rieslings and California Rieslings, and one from Washington, and Chateau Ste. Michelle won the tasting, stole the show, and the rest is history. Another crucial point in our history was in the early 90s, we conducted a total quality management program. And one of the chief things that caused was a lot more French oak barrels. And so our barrel budget went up by millions of dollars every year, but we really found that the structure that these great barrels would give the wine extended maceration, doing things that really were kind of classic winemaking techniques to get the international benchmarks of high-end wine. That really was important in our improvement of quality. The Wine Spectator does this analysis of 90 rated wines. We have more 90 rated wines tasted than any other region of the world, and the lowest prices. So the value proposition is clearly there. High quality, fair prices. We think it's a winning combination. It's interesting that there hasn't been a real land rush. We are seeing quite a few Napa-based wineries coming up here now, which we're very excited about. We think it validates our business. We used to buy land for $10,000 an acre here, and it's gone up to the princely price of maybe $25,000 an acre. And in Napa, we know what vineyard land is. It's 300,000 plus, $500,000 plus, and the price of grapes are going up dramatically, and it's hard to produce a great bottle of wine under $100. Our philosophy has always been, what's good for the Washington category is good for us. We want to grow the category as the category leader, and we'll get our fair share. But we have, upon occasion, when there's been desperation because of winter kill, we have actually supported the industry by providing grapes to other wineries. You don't have to stomp somebody out or prohibit market share growth or anything like that, because you're going to grow the category. The category grows faster than the total wine segment. You're going to have success. In the area of D2C, it's very important to Washington. We were the first winery here in Woodinville in 1976. Now there are over 100 wineries and tasting rooms in Woodinville, and it drives a lot of commerce. Many small wineries, 80 to 100% of what they sell is D2C. We have just invested $8 million in a new visitor center, which is really spectacular. And we've got an 80-seat movie theater with tasting tables. We've got a blending room. We've got an Enoteca that sells all our imports. And this winery has about 30 concerts a year, including people like Santana and Bob Dylan and Paul Simon and John Legend and other greats. Stevie Wonder was the best concert we've ever had, by the way. And we really believe that the greatest way to create brand ambassadors is our direct accounts. And in fact, we get over 300,000 people a year here at Chateau Ste. Michelle Woodinville, which by far is the greatest number of any winery we have. Now, one of the things that we had this year, last month, was a 50th anniversary celebration. And we brought a lot of the old timers, the people that were here when the chateau was built. And it's pretty fascinating because one of them was the president of Chateau Ste. Michelle in 1976. He was on the tour with Andrei Tchelistcheff when they did the Judgment of Paris in France. And he helped bring in wine that won the Judgment of Paris, which is kind of a small world story. But I asked him a few years ago if he really understood the critical nature of building this winery here instead of in Eastern Washington. And he said, yeah, pretty much. And I said, but the difference is that we get 20,000 people at wineries over there. We get 300,000 here. And did you know at the time how brilliant it was to locate the winery here outside of the vineyard region? And he was very modest about it, but it was clearly a genius decision, at least in hindsight. In the US, we would be the 7th largest wine company, but specifically, if you just take premium wine, we're the 3rd largest. Chateau Ste. Michelle is clearly the biggest. The next largest is 14 Hands and was the fastest winery to reach 2 million cases in the state of Washington. And the third is Columbia Crest. Erath is growing so rapidly that we include in this power brand grouping. So it's the fourth leg on the chair, and it's growing so fast, it's pretty remarkable. And as Oregon in general, I think the appreciation of Oregon Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris is really raising fast. Most consumer categories have a triangle, and you have the very high end, small volume. You have the lower end, large volume. So we have various tiers within Chateau Ste. Michelle, including the Columbia Valley tier, then we get to Indian Wells, then we move to our single vineyard sites, and the very top is called Ethos, which is basically reserve, and it means what we stand for. So that's an example of tiering under Chateau Ste. Michelle label. In 1974, UST bought Ste. Michelle, and then it was merged into Altria in 2009. The great thing is, we know the wine business, we manage it locally, they're supportive. That's really a good proposition. We were in the middle of negotiating to buy several wineries. Erath in Oregon, which we acquired in 2005. We had Spring Valley and Walla Walla, very famous winery. We were getting into this mode of acquisition. And we would see our competitors, and sometimes much larger companies, buy these trophy wineries, and then they would have buyer's remorse and strip them down. And it just didn't make sense to us. So we created this program we call String of Pearls. So each winery has its own identity. It has its own winemaking team, its own estate vineyards, it has its own legacy, and really is unique and individualistic. The string is basically just the back of the house. So it's HR, sales, everything that we get some modest synergies out of, but it's not to drive a lot of money out of the purchase price. And we can never figure out why somebody would go out and have an incredible EBITDA multiple. And then once they got it, they would sell off the vineyard, they would sell off, get rid of the winemakers, and eliminate what made that a trophy in the first place. One great example of that is Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, the fabled winner of the Judgment of Paris. The Judgment of Paris was an incredible event, and prior to that, it was all about France. If it was wine, it was French wine. Everybody else was out there in the cosmos. So what Steven Spurrier did to create that tasting event was unbelievable. And that had such an impact. In fact, Robert Mondavi said, this is not just about Napa Valley, this is about all of California. And by extension, I would add Oregon and Washington. That was the single most powerful event in history. We have consumers in China that just demand the first release of Cask 23 every year. It's unbelievable. Antinores are a 26th generation family. They're wonderful people. We have a great association with them. They started making wine a little bit before us. 1385 was their first vintage. And they have this multi-generational family, which was on 60 Minutes and chronicled as one of the great wine businesses, and actually businesses in the world. So in 1995, he was here, and we approached him and said, would you be interested in a partnership? And his answer was simply, why not? And so the first vintage of Kolslari was 1995. It was a turning point, not only for our business, but for the validation of Washington State. That when you have a Tuscan gentleman with 25 generations history, and he comes and says, I'm going to validate Washington State. That was a big deal. Since we are tied at the hip with Cole Solari and Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, our engagement has been very extensive. But for the import portfolio, we have exclusive distribution in the United States. It's virtually their full portfolio. We also work with them buying grapes from them. For us to be in the Northwest but not in Oregon was foolish. And so we wanted to get there. One of the concerns we had was they would consider us to be the big gorilla coming to Oregon. And we were concerned about that. And then I told a journalist with the Oregonian the truth, which was I was born in Oregon. And that changed the entire thing. And it was basically, a prodigal son comes home, and we didn't miss a beat, and everybody pretty much thought it was a great positive thing for Oregon wineries. So we acquired the Erath winery, and it's been highly successful. It's a great property, and it's one that we are investing a lot of money in. We're going to build a new winery and tasting room. We had a banker we were working with, and he said, what are you interested in? And I said, Sonoma. We have nothing in Sonoma. I'd really like a property in Sonoma. He said, oh, okay, well, we know of some and might be interesting. And then he said, do you have some wineries in mind? I said, Patson Hall. He says, oh, it's not for sale. I said, that's where you come in. And so we proceeded, and it took a while, and we had to meet first a screening team, second the founders. The founders, I think probably, were concerned, that we would take their baby and change it. And we said, no, that's the string of pearls. You get to run it. Then in 1999, Ernst Lozen came by, and Riesling had kind of drifted a little bit at that time. We were still the #1 producer of Riesling in the world, but it had drifted. And so he came in, he says, I have a dream about producing a luxury-priced American Riesling. And I've tasted your Washington Rieslings, and they're wonderful. And so we ended up going into this venture with Ernst, and the first 5 years made the Wine Spectator Top 100 every year. I mean, it was really quite spectacular. We had a single berry select dessert wine with botrytis that we only made 24 cases of. And our chief financial officer found out that it took 650 hours to make just 24 cases of wine, and he immediately retired. Then we ended up getting a 98 rating on this wine, which at the time was the highest white wine rating in the Wine Spectator. So we had a lottery for all the cases. So it was $250 for a half bottle of wine. And the demand far outstripped. So we go to the Manor House, and we have this wonderful presentation of your bottle of wine, a half a bottle of wine for $250. I would enjoy doing that more frequently. We also are innovating in a new area, and we have a wine called Pundit. Now, the backstory on this is a guy we worked with in the late 80s with importing Bordeaux's, went off to do something else, and he went to start his own vineyard. I saw him 3 years ago in Hong Kong, and he came up to me at Vinexpo Hong Kong, and he said, I'd like to do something like you're doing with Antinori and with Ernst Lozen. I said, come to Seattle and we'll talk about it. And he came, and he was so fascinated about the joint venture, and so we created a wine called Pundit. And Pundit is Syrah, but it doesn't say Syrah on the front label. And it's a very sinister looking owl that is almost vicious looking. And this has been the best way to sell Syrah that I know, the Pundit. And then we have another wine called the Tenet, which is a GSM and very high-end, kind of a Chateauneuf du Pape style wine. So Intrinsic is really a fabulous project that we started a couple years ago, and it has done very well with the rating services. It's extremely unique. The packaging is from a Brooklyn street artist, and it's a woman in a bright red dress. It's a Cabernet Sauvignon, and what's unique about it is it's aged in cement, open-top cement tanks. And it has long maceration, and it is velvety smooth. And it sells for about $20 to $25, but it's been wonderfully successful. Today, innovation is critically important in the wine business. I would say 10 years ago, there was modest innovation. Today, you have to be successful by creating and being innovative. We're basically farmers, so we have to worry about the weather and what happens. And this has been kind of a unique year here in Washington specifically. We had a lot of mildew that came from a very wet spring. Now the summer was exceptionally hot and wonderful, but we're seeing a little reduction in crop size. And some growers actually have decided not to farm anything off their vineyards. So that's unique. At one time, we were over 50% of our fruit came off our own vineyards. But because we've grown so dramatically, we've had to reduce that. And so now we have a network of growers that we have long-term contracts with, particularly in Washington State, lesser in Oregon and California. But here we have these long-time relationships with growers, and they will plant vineyards for us. They will take all the upfront, all the time that it takes to come to fruition. They will invest up front. Climate change is an interesting topic because we see in Europe it changing quite dramatically, getting hotter. Whereas we haven't seen that much of it here. The one thing I would add is that we have different microclimates. So we could go further north up by Lake Chelan if things were too hot in the Wahluke Slope and areas that are right now the hottest areas. We have a vineyard called Coal Creek. That's one of the hottest vineyards in the state. So the wines are incredible and very dense. Walla Walla, it's warm, but it's not real hot. So, it depends on the microclimate. And there's so many in Eastern Washington. Along the river is one area that, the Columbia River, which is quite different than, let's say, up on the Wahluke Slope. It was a lot more time building the WSU Wine Science Center than I thought. In fact, I was given the project personally to raise $23 million. And I thought coming out of a recession, that was not going to happen. And we did. We raised $23 million. And it is highly successful. We're producing scientifically trained enologists, viticulturists that I would say before the center, it would take us 2 or 3 years to train somebody in viticulture. We're getting these master's candidates coming out that are turnkey day one. And you think about that in terms of fruit growing, the quality of fruit, and also being job ready day one. What we're seeing is people are moving to higher quality wine, and it's through every generation. So it's millennials are moving up. Now, what we also see is that millennials tend to like a little sweeter wine. I hate to generalize because there are many that don't, but At the same time, that's not new. You know, when we became wine consumers, we did it with things like Lancers and Blue Nun. I don't know anybody that had their first glass of wine with Chateau Lafite Rothschild. And so what we see is this tendency to start drinking a little sweeter wine, and then they go drier as people age. And we think it'll be the same thing with this generation. Generation Xers are becoming more frequent wine consumers as they, get into their 40s. And then you look at baby boomers, and that's fascinating because we've seen baby boomers actually slow down their wine consumption a little bit. And it takes 2.3 millennials to make up for one lost baby boomer because they have discretionary spending, they have a real interest in wine and food, and so you hate to lose any baby boomers at all. The advice I would give is there's great room. And when you see the number of wineries expanding, there are lots of different ways to get into the industry and be successful. Certainly working in a winery tasting room is a very, very good way to break into the business, but working for distributors, we're seeing lots of consolidation in the distributor tier, but at the same time, it's creating more opportunities. And I think there's never been a better time because there's never been higher wine consumption. We continue to set record wine consumption in the United States year in, year out. And with that are opportunities for careers.